Because mine's, yeah.
Hi, we can see you.
We can see you, that's fine. Okay.
So we've got Oksana.
All good. Got Oksana,
Yeah.
haven't got Sahi.
William, do you want me to sit there and wait? Or do you
Yes, I
want to
think,
wait?
no, I think you should sit there. I think you
No,
should sit down, introduce you
he's the
early on.
one now. Oksana is later. Do you want us to call him?
I don't think
Yeah, let me message him.
But he has a video we can play anyway.
Yeah, but I will message him and say we're starting.
So I'm going to move off now. At least we know that Oksana is there and she can hear us.
very good. Hello, Oksana. Very good to have you with us.
You need to be, there's a lot of noise. So, yeah, okay.
Just to say hello, good morning, Oksana. Thank you so much for joining us early. So you can hear okay. Excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
I've emailed.
Fine.
Say it again.
On mute now. Thank you.
Do you want me to put on the video?
Mhm.
Good. Well, we can be better. So good morning, everyone. All right. Yeah, thank you very much for being here. We are going to start shortly. So I just want to mention briefly, like you got first aid, and we're not expecting any fire. But if you don't see any fire, we have a fire exit, you just go out the door, and then you'll see the sign that takes you down the stairs, and it continues down to the open doors, where you move out to the bathroom homes. So you're welcome, and we are going to start very shortly. I have William here in charge of this session, and we have our special guests as well going to introduce them. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see that you're in good voice, and it's going to be an interactive session, so we're looking forward to your input very much. I'm William Horsley. I'm the International Director of the Centre for Freedom of the Media, CFOM, which was set up more than 10 years ago here at the University of Sheffield. Delighted that Professor Jackie Harrison, the chair of CFOM, head of department, and also the holder of the UNESCO chair in media freedom, journalist safety, and the issue of impunity is with us, with other members of the faculty. So today we have an exciting, and it's as live broadcast. It's got as many actors and participants in it as the Ben-Hur chariot race scene in the famous film. We have two speakers from Ukraine who you will hear from. One is the head of the journalist union there, Serhiy Tomilenko, who's done a splendid video for us if he can, he will join us live as well in this first half. We have also Clotilde Redfern, who is the director of the Rory Peck Trust, which is a worldwide organization of support for freelance journalists. So in this session, I'm going to introduce you to some of the thorniest issues in the intersection between journalism, politics, and government, and the issue, of course, of war and conflict. The main theme of this International Journalism Week is journalism in times of crisis and conflict. And just to let you know the outline plan, so the first hour will last up to about 5 to 12, and you have a very short break at that time to go to the restroom or have a cappuccino. Afterwards, we will continue with the second half, and we have already up on the line with us another speaker from Ukraine live. Oksana Romaniuk is director for several years of the Institute of Mass Information, which plays an extremely important part. Part of the lesson of today's event is that the rules of the game, the operations of journalism in a society are a matter of very close public interest. They are now a matter of enormous concern at the UN level and international level. And so the role of not just governments who make the laws, but also the non-government sector, the experts, academia, and lawyers and others, all these stakeholders, they create the world within which we live. And the idea of journalism is to create a society of informed citizens. Now, a quick word about CFOM before we hear from Serhiy Tomilenko in Kiev. The center, the mandate of the center, and particularly of the UNESCO chair, which Jackie holds, is to convene and improve the quality and applicability of research in this area, and also to interact with all these other stakeholders. And last week, I and others here, Gemma Horton and Lada included, were in Vienna for an enormous meeting, the biggest meeting for 10 years, of all these stakeholders, considering what together the governments of the world can do, the intergovernmental organizations, those who make the law, and the experts can do. So I won't go into detail on that, but what I do want to do in connection with the reason for CFOM is to show you very quickly 2 slides of the foundational document of international human rights after the Second World War. In the Second World War, as you know, there was genocide against the Jewish population and other minorities, and 45 million or more people were killed around the world. After that, the world came together on the 10th of December, 1948, and unanimously, extraordinary considering the tensions in world affairs, they agreed on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a political declaration, and the wording is really, really important for you to understand. This is the foundation of the importance of journalism in our world. It says in the preamble, disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. We proclaim a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want as the highest aspirations of the common people. Please bear that in mind, and you see that that freedom of expression comes first among all of those. And if you can have the next slide as two, Article 19 deals particularly with the right to freedom of expression. And you should really know this by heart. This is the foundation of the rights of journalists and their role in society, which is not an unlimited privilege, but it is a key element. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. All of those elements are extremely important, and in the more than 70 international treaties have been founded on the basis of this article. And the role of the media in particular is given a very special place, special protections for the role of journalists, providing that they follow the ethics and rules of journalism is at the foundation of what we do. Right, enough from me really. I'll just briefly now tell you something about Serhiy Tomilenko. He, like most of the speakers here with us today, have a background in active journalism. I myself was a BBC correspondent for more than 20 years in East Asia, in Europe, and visiting other countries, including Russia and the United States. So Serhiy is the president of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. You can imagine on February the 24th this year, even though Ukraine had been at a low-level war with Russia in the Donbass in the east for 8 years, all hell broke loose. And he's going to tell us about the impact on his organization, on how journalists have tried to keep themselves safe, how they tried to keep up the standards, the professional standards of journalism, and also how they deal with the torrent of disinformation, propaganda, and hate coming from the Russian side, and also the issue of excessive controls on the side of his own government. Again, please learn lessons from these and think about your role. Can I just ask you before we start, how many people here intend or expect to be a journalist at some point in their lives? Can you put your hands up immediately? That's probably a majority. I'm pleased to see that. So I hope you'll learn a lot from this. So here is Serhiy Tomilenko explaining what he does and what it's been like since February in Ukraine.
Dear friends, it's a great honor for me to be one of the speakers during the International Journalist Week organized by your Sheffield University and dear William Horsley and his team. My name is Serhiy Tomilenko, and I am the president of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, the largest journalistic association in the country. In these difficult times of war, our union is at the forefront of helping media workers who suffered from the war, just as we are trying to support our brave colleagues who continue to perform professional duties under the incredible challenges of war. I will use a presentation during my talk. And I hope these slides will give a better idea of Ukrainian realities. I am recording this video for you from the office of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, located in the center of our capital. The staff is actively working, but like every Ukrainian, we work and live in constant tension due to Russian shelling of peaceful Ukrainian cities. Here is a photo I took from my office window on the morning of October 10, when Kyiv was hit by one of the largest Russian missile attacks. The place where the rocket hit is 700 meters from our office. And also, to represent our realities, here is another photo about our working atmosphere. The Russians are destroying Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which is why the government is implementing regular 4-hour blackouts. But it's difficult to stop all work activities. In the photo, my colleagues and I are holding a working meeting regarding requests for help that are addressed to our network of journalist solidarity centers. The National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, NUJU, has not stopped its work for a single day since February 24th this year. On the morning of February 24th, an operational meeting of the NUJU leadership was held online. First of all regional organizations and the central office ensured reliable storage of data about members, as well as access to clean forms of press cards. Unfortunately, based on the experience of 214, we already understood this information is interesting for the occupiers, and press cards can be used for further provocations. At the same time, a decision was made to evacuate the central office from Kyiv. To diversify the risks, the team was divided and two Nuzhuz relocated offices were created in Western Ukraine. From the first days of the war, the team of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine provided operational advice on evacuation. Such assistance was provided not only to Nuzhu members, but to all journalists and media workers who turned to us for help. In the event of an emergency, we provided colleagues with a small amount of financial assistance to pay for tickets, fuel, accommodation, etc. According to Nuzhu's own survey, 30% editorial offices temporarily suspended work for a period of 1 to 3 months. 20% was stopped work and has not been resumed until now, and 15% switched to remote work. 15 media having their staff journalists mobilized to the armed forces. In Ukraine, there are currently certain restrictions on the dissemination of information by the authorities. For example, it's forbidden to promptly publish information about the locations of explosions or the movement of military equipment. But such moments are important components of our country's defense. Therefore, this can be considered a violation of freedom of speech. But at the same time, our union and the whole Ukrainian media space are concerned that the Ukrainian authorities have reactivated the process of implementing the law on media. This law provides global media censorship tools to the state regulator, the National Council of Television and Radio Broadcasting of Ukraine. Ukrainian journalists, not only members of our union, spoke out against the draft law on media many times. More than 100 newsrooms collected signatures demanding not to adopt this law. 95% of print media editors oppose regulation of the print industry by the state television and radio regulator. It seems like an outright attack on free media under a fake flag. The National Union of Journalists of Ukraine supports the need for Ukraine to fulfill its obligations to the European Union, but opposes the law on media. As on November 2nd this year, according to the verified data of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, and our Ministry of Culture and Informational Policy, 43 journalists, media workers were killed during the Russian-Ukrainian war. 8 journalists killed while performing journalistic activities. Of them, 6 were killed during the active phase of the battles near Kyiv. Therefore, the main danger for journalists working in the frontline regions is physical safety. It's worth noting that the work of independent journalists is impossible in the territories occupied by Russia, including Mariupol, for example. Russian soldiers are targetedly looking for journalists. At one moment, all Ukrainian journalists became frontline. At the same time, most of them didn't have any theoretical and practical skills regarding the realities of work in wartime conditions. In addition, Russian soldiers don't follow the rules of war. The press mark for them is a target, not immunity. In the first days of war, it became clear that there is almost no protective equipment for journalists in Ukraine. In the first days of the war, it became clear that there is almost no protective equipment for journalists in Ukraine. So we started promptly sending a request to all international organizations and international partners. Thanks to their help, we managed to get additional protective equipment and make the work of journalists a little safer. Of course, it would be impossible to deal with all the challenges only at the national level. Our union manages to implement all its activities thanks to the support of international partners. With the support of the International and European Federation of Journalists, a network of journalist solidarity centers was launched. Human rights activities are supported by the civil rights defenders, permanent partner for safety and monitoring issues, the Justice for Journalists Foundation. Our Rhone initiative is a network of journalist solidarity centers. In 6 cities, there are small offices equipped with laptops where there is a rental point of protective equipment. Our staff takes care of appeals from dozens and hundreds of journalists. After all, many journalists have been relocated from temporarily occupied territories or from regions where hostilities are taking place. We take care of journalists who were injured during shelling. Emergency financial assistance is provided through our network. We implement training programs on physical and psychological safety. Now, most of the materials of Ukrainian journalists are about the war or its consequences. This topic is relevant for readers and has taken the leading places by itself. Of course, we urge journalists not to neglect safety. We regularly hold training events. Also, in April, the team of our union ensured the process of Ukrainian language official adaptation of the UNESCO and Reporters Without Borders Handbook Safety Guide for Journalists, a handbook for reporters in high-risk environments. Online version of this handbook was promoted on our online resources. The printed versions were distributed throughout Ukraine through NUJU's branches and journalist solidarity centers. The National Union of Journalists of Ukraine is an organization that protects the rights and interests of journalists and media workers. Properly documenting war crimes requires considerable legal knowledge. Therefore, special human rights NGOs deal with this. Russian state journalists are the horn of Kremlin propaganda. Back on February 28th, our union appealed to Russian journalists under the slogan, "Journalism is not propaganda." But our colleagues didn't draw any conclusions. They continued to cynically lie in broadcasts and materials. And the worst thing is that they call on their audience to kill Ukrainians. Ukrainian media are really in a difficult situation. There are no financial revenues. The advertising market has been destroyed, but people continue to work, some even without salaries, because they understand the importance of reporting objective information to their audience. International media also play a very important role. They show the real picture of the circumstances in Ukraine, thus countering Russian propaganda. We, as the largest journalistic organization of Ukraine, thank all foreign media and freelancers for covering events in Ukraine. Also, if necessary, we always help our colleagues with safety equipment, with accreditation, with more other requests. Also, we recognize the importance of international organizations. The international legal framework is a very important component. Of course, we would like more prompt decision-making and stricter prosecution process. At the institutional level, UNESCO helps our organization. Since the first days of the war, UNESCO has been actively helping Ukrainian journalists. Methodical and training assistance, supply of protective equipment, and readiness to provide individual grant support. Dear friends, thank you for the great support that Ukrainian journalists always feel. I believe that through mutual support and solidarity, we will overcome the current difficult challenges. Journalists are important. This is the main slogan of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. Today, it sounds more literal than ever, emphasizing the courage of journalists and people's need for reliable information. Thank you.
You'll let me know in case he is, because we do want to make this interactive, and I do have your questions ready. I think we'll move on quickly, though, to our second speaker. I just comment very briefly on what Sehi said there. He talked as the head of his own National Union of Journalists about an outright attack on free media in his own country. So the role of journalists is very often to stand against what is popular, or what is the majority, or what is ordered from their own government in the name of the ethics and profession of journalists. He also mentioned some of the dreadful, appalling propaganda coming from the Russian side for many years, particularly since 2014. One that I remember myself was the Russian state media speaking about alleging that Ukrainian forces were responsible for crucifying a 5-year-old boy because he was not loyal to Ukraine. Of course, it was completely untrue. Recently, a senior Russian figure urged Russian soldiers to put Ukrainian children in a bus or in a building and burn it until they were dead. This is the kind of corruption of journalism that can happen when you have an authoritarian system, and why it's important to make the link between journalism and free and open societies. Now, Clotilde will speak to you now about the special role of freelance journalists in the Ukraine arena and around the world. Many of the most famous journalists in history have effectively been freelance. It requires a great deal of ambition, get up and go, and intelligence to become an effective freelance journalist. You are more vulnerable on the whole than journalists who work for large organizations, which will have support networks, maybe insurance backup, they'll give you training and so on. All of that is likely to be lacking if you are a freelance, but you have a great opportunity because your individual initiative can get you the story and make you famous, but that comes with very great risks, as Clotilde will explain with some slides as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your International Journalism Week. I'm really happy to be here. If any of you want to know a little bit more about the Rory Pack Trust, I've put some flyers on the front row here if you're interested. So I do have some slides, and the first slide is a very short 2-minute video to explain the trust for any of you that are not familiar with us. Has anyone come across the Rory Pack Trust already? Is anyone familiar
Hands
with
up,
the Rory Patch
please.
Trust?
Hands up.
Okay, not
A
many,
few.
so we'll play the video if you want a bit. Sorry, thanks.
I'd like to actually thank the Rory Pet Trust. Since I was a baby freelancer, they have supported me with safety training. And actually, the genesis of this film starts with me surviving a suicide bombing in Iraq, where I was quite badly injured. And it was the trust and many of the freelance community who were in this room who actually stepped in to support me. So it's wonderful to be here tonight, having started there to receive this. It feels like it's gone full circle. So thank you very much to the trust.
It's just so encouraging that an organisation like Rory Hicks exists who do care, not just about tangible things, but about intangible things.
It's gratifying to know that your work is being recognized when you're telling important stories that the world needs to hear from remote parts of the world.
This award means a lot to me because it is a testament that my efforts have succeeded in shining a light in the middle of information blackouts and making the voice of Ethiopian war victims heard across borders.
So I'd like to ask you to think a little bit about the role of international freelance journalists going to cover a war like the one in Ukraine. We heard very, very eloquently from Sergei in the first presentation about the challenges that being a national journalist that they experience reporting from Ukraine. And I just want to have you really think about how a freelance international journalist can work in partnership with the talented journalists in the country who are trying to tell the truth of the war and what's going on in their country. So this is the title of a really interesting piece of research. It's research-based tips for avoiding unintended harm to your local collaborators and yourself. And this is the title of Joanna Kotosova's research, she's a fellow at the University of Amsterdam. And she talked to many, many journalists and local freelancers and field producers and what is sometimes referred to as fixers in Ukraine. And she titled her piece, "Are you a journalist going to Ukraine? Don't be a jerk." And the reason is that there is an imbalance of power between international journalists who have access to possibly the best resourced global news outlets and the national journalists desperately trying to get the story out. There are two different agendas. National journalists will want to inform their own audience, the locals and the national audience, but some of them will also want to make sure that the international audience has the right story. And they can do that in partnership with freelancers that come in. There is, unfortunately, a tendency for freelancers to rush to war zones in the goal of making a name for themselves. And many of the safety trainers I come across and speak to tell me that the biggest risk to freelance journalism is inexperience and lack of safety training and naivety, quite frankly, about the risks that you're taking. And you should really consider these because you may be adding to the burden of the local journalism community. When the war broke out, we received lots and lots of calls from international freelance journalists wanting our support to provide safety kit, safety training, give them assistance on how to cover the conflict. And we actually had to develop a clear policy to discourage people from going unless they had support from a known outlet, safety training, and a commission, a confirmed commission. As William said, you can make your name as a freelance journalist, but the risks are real. And because My organisation is focused on trying to keep freelance journalists safe so that they can continue their valuable work. I am going to give you a bit of a reality check about the risks. But what I thought was really interesting in this piece of research, which you can find online, and I'm happy to share my slides, which have the links attached to them, is she asks really important questions. For example, will your eyewitness testimony about others suffering help anything or anyone? Or are you driven by the urge to see and experience the war yourself? Does the desire involve your adrenaline levels or your career cupidity? Do you know how to behave under shelling? Do you know basic first aid procedures? Do you know how you react to the smell of corpses, the sound of shooting and bombs? Are you ready to deal with images of suffering, destruction and death? Have you ever had a panic attack? And are you going to hinder anybody? International journalists can do a huge amount of good if they work in equal partnership with the journalists in country. There's a huge amount of talent there, and the only reason really to go, in my opinion, is if you can help tell the story for everyone involved. Have the next slide, please. So this is what I've been talking about. You can just fast forward to the next slide. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the risks to bear in mind. Traditionally, physical risks were the key focus. There are whole departments of ex-military staff who are very experienced in operating in hostile environments who assist the news teams and all the big broadcasters. I know you've had members of the BBC risk team speak in previous days at this International Journalism Week, so you will have had a reality check from them, no doubt. We've isolated 4 intersecting areas of risk, as you can see behind me. The traditional physical risks that you will learn about in hostile environment and first aid training courses, often called HEFAT. The Rory Peck Trust actually has a training fund to make this training, which is very expensive, affordable to freelance journalists. You can apply to us if you want to do this training. If you're interested in covering conflict, you will not be commissioned without it. There is also, obviously, digital security concerns. You can have all the HEFAT training in the world. If you're not digitally secure, you will be putting yourself, your sources, and your stories at risk. Digital tracking of journalists and your whereabouts is very sophisticated now. Hacking of journalists is very sophisticated, and increasingly, journalists are harassed online to the extent where they can become really quite mentally ill as a result. Digital security is really, really important to get your head around. You can't do journalism without it. There's also a legal risk element that you should consider. Legal attacks against journalists are growing. You may have heard of SLAPs, which are strategic lawsuits against public participation. These are designed to tie journalists up in legal knots and silence journalists by stopping their work so they have to focus on a law case instead. There are also just basic media laws that you need to understand for the country you're going to report on. One really good example that came up this year for some safety training we did in Kenya ahead of their elections there was that it's illegal to interview anyone coming out of a Kenyan polling station within 10 meters of the polling station. So if you're unfamiliar with that law, you could very easily be rightfully arrested for interviewing somebody who's just been at the polling station without just through ignorance of the laws and falling foul of them and giving the police an excuse to get you off your beat. The psychological risks is something I've become increasingly interested in. Frontline journalism does inevitably have a psychological toll. And it's very important to be very honest with yourself about your personality and your psychological makeup and how you think you will react to covering a war. It will leave an impact on you. And it's important to prepare for that and also to be really aware of resilience training. We have a resilience program at the Rory Pack Trust where we have been partnering with the Dart Centre Europe that specialises on trauma-aware journalism to give you training and awareness about the psychosocial impact of conflict journalism. The more aware you are and the more you can communicate and plan periods of recovery between intense reporting, the better journalist you will be. It's not just about being healthy, it's actually about improving the quality of your journalism. There's a reason I presented the risks in this way. Traditionally, it was felt that there was a respect for press and that everyone wanted to support the reporting of accurate facts in wars and war zones. Sadly, as time has gone on, having a press label on your flak jacket or even just the letters TV on your van no longer offers you protection. If anything, it creates a target on your back, and you need to be aware of that if you're going to do this kind of journalism and mitigate those risks. So, why would anybody go into this kind of journalism in the first place then, seeing as following that bit of a reality check? Well, there are highs. Obviously, there are highs. You get to travel and see the world. You get to meet lots of interesting people. You get to do something that feels important. And of course, you have a front seat to history in the making. And journalists are an essential pillar of democracy. Democracy doesn't really work without journalism and an agreed version of facts. Can we have the next slide, please? There are intense lows, however, which you should mitigate and be aware of. It is a highly risky profession, particularly if you focus on conflict journalism. It's incredibly stressful. There is a high exposure to trauma, as I've mentioned. As a freelancer in particular, you will be poorly paid and often paid late. And your work will be insecure and unpredictable. We try and help with these lows by offering freelance journalists key fact training, the resilience program I've mentioned, and webinars on the business of freelancing. How do you actually make ends meet as a freelance journalist? All of these are accessible on our website. One thing I've been listening to all week, and we can jump to the next slide. This is a fascinating 7-part podcast series produced by Tortoise, an online news outlet. It's all about the story of Christopher Allen. He was a British-American freelance journalist who covered war and conflict for various international news outlets. He is the perfect example, or an interesting example, of a young, ambitious journalist in his early 20s who had always aspired to being a war reporter, who took himself first actually to cover the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, and then on to South Sudan, where he felt history was unfolding and he wanted to get the story. Chris was sadly killed on August 26, 2017, aged just 26. Pig Iron is a 7-part podcast investigating who he was and how he died. It's never really been there's not been an adequate investigation. His family have spoken about his case to the UN Human Rights Commission. There's been a lot of advocacy to try and have his murder investigated with not much conclusion. This journalistic investigation is as close as you're going to get. It's also incredibly honest about the bits of journalism that are not great for freelancers trying to navigate that world. I would really recommend it. It's actually a really fascinating kind of true crime type investigation podcast. It's very well made, it's very interesting, and it will give you a good feel for the ethical as well as practical challenges of being a frontline reporter. If you want to know a little more about independent journalists and being a freelancer and covering hostile environment stories, you can also, if you go to the next slide, you can also look up the Rory Peck Awards on Channel 4. So this is just a screen grab from the Channel 4 website. Can you push the next slide? The information will come up. Right. So this is unbelievable timing because next week the Rory Peck Awards are taking place in London. It's in a ceremony where we recognise outstanding contributions from freelance journalists around the world, and we bring them to London to showcase their work and try and support them in that way and recognise their contributions. It's an unbelievably difficult thing to do, but journalism, particularly independent journalism, which is often driven by freelancers, is so important. So we run an award ceremony to give them moral support and recognition, and we're very lucky that Channel 4 interviews some of the finalists and creates lovely little 5-minute films that are broadcast after the news the week of the awards. So on Monday next week, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, you will be able to watch short 5-minute interviews with independent freelance journalists about their work and the stories that they've covered. On Monday, you can see Yusuf Ankar will be talking about her reporting on warlords of Nigeria. Sorry, I think it's his reporting. Raoul on climate change in Antarctica is interviewed on Tuesday. Wednesday, there's Ramita Navai, who you may have heard of, a well-known journalist filming undercover filming of women's prison in Afghanistan. And Thursday is an interview with Surabhi Tandon about her report on India hitting 50 degrees Celsius this summer and how people are fighting climate change impact on their lives. Thank you. But I'm really open to questions. This is just, on the next slide, this is just a few faces of some of the international freelance journalists we've supported through our programs.
Thank you, Clotilde. Now, I was going to say, hands up anyone who's been asleep in the last few minutes. It's not allowed. Questions and comments coming up. I'll very quickly ask one first to give you time to think. Who was Rory Peck?
So Rory Peck was a news video journalist who actually died in Russia covering the Moscow coup of '93. When he died, his family, his wife and his 2 children, had absolutely no support because he was freelance. Not being staff meant he had no financial support for the fact that he died at work doing his job as a journalist. He actually got a Medal of Honour and Bravery given upon him by the government of Russia in recognition for his work at the time, but no other support. And it was his widow, Juliet Peck, who set up the Rory Peck Trust to support other hardworking freelance journalists and provide a safety net when things go wrong.
Good. Now's your chance. We'd like to hear any comments because it will help us to develop the themes we've been hearing about, and questions in particular for Clotilde. I'm not sure we've got, don't think we've got Serhi up live from Ukraine. So it's your turn, over to you. Who's going to be first? Yes, please.
Hi.
Near the front. Please speak up. Oh, there's a phone, there's a microphone.
Hi. You mentioned that you will provide the support, safety, and welfare of the freelance journalists. Can you give more details about what you give them to support them, such as maybe financial support or training?
Sure. So the way we support freelance journalists at the Rory Peck Trust is through various means. We have financial assistance funds, one called a crisis fund and a recovery fund, which will give financial grants to freelance journalists in crisis or in recovery from an accident as a result of their work. These typically represent about 3 months' worth of costs to help them pay for their rent and food and basic necessities. We hope that those grants make the difference between a hard-working journalist being able to continue following their vocation or dropping out of journalism entirely. The goal is always to try and support valuable talent to remain in this sector. The other way we support freelance journalists is with safety training. So we have a training fund that you can apply for if you want a bursary to cover the cost of hostile environment first aid training, which is essential if you want to cover conflict, if you want to do conflict reporting. And then we also have a therapy fund and some resilience training, which makes you aware of the psychological toll of journalism on yourself, and also makes you aware of how to sensitively interview contributors who have been exposed to trauma without harming them. So it's about responsible journalism for your contributors and for yourself, so that you can stay resilient and improve your journalism. And if you need psychological support, we have grants, therapy grants, that can pay for some of that treatment, 8 to 10 sessions to start your recovery.
Who's next? Who's next? Quick question then. Who can remember what the meaning is of HEFAT? HEFAT training was mentioned a few times by Clotilde. Just please just have a hand, somebody who remembers what it means. Please? Don't say it all asleep. Yes, please, please, stand up and say it loudly.
Yeah, very close.
Say it again.
Very close.
I can't remember what the H was. But
H is hostile.
hostile environment in the state.
Yeah.
That is, if you go to one of those courses, it will serve you extremely well in life, I promise you. Self-defense, survival, how to stop an artery from bleeding to death, how to jump over a country fence without stopping. I mean, these are really important things. How to survive if you're a hostage.
Yeah. I heard recently from a HEFAT trainer that most journalists take a first aid kit with them, but they don't actually know how to use it. They don't know how to use the content that's in it. These are very basic skills. You might not think of essential first aid as a journalism skill, but it absolutely is if you're going to be working in a war zone.
We've still got time for a couple of questions and comments. Please do speak up now. Most of you said that you were going into journalism, so there must be a lot of things buzzing in your mind. At the back, please, microphone. Thank you, William.
Great job.
Regimental Sergeant Major.
I was wondering, since most news organisations usually have an for opposition, even when that's a conflict, is there a degree of ideological or general freedom to freelance journalism from its own? Because yesterday we basically learned that when you go there, it's practically chaos and you have to make day-to-day decisions. They can't really see a lot of wiggle room. Freedom of presentation and such issues.
Can you just repeat that last comment? You can't see wiggle room for...
There seems to be a lot of wiggle room on how you present things. It's rather a day-to-day affair.
Yes, I would say that's accurate, that if you're war reporting, you're actually trying as best you can to record the facts and relay them. There's a big difference between news journalism, the day-to-day of recording facts and bearing with trying to, uncover the truth of what is going on, which is harder than it sounds, particularly in a war zone, or interpreting or analysing what's going on. You can't do that on a live news day-to-day basis. But it's very, very important to report the truth. William and I were at the conference in Vienna earlier this week, listening to or attending the 10-year anniversary of the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists. It's a very big, growing issue. And Muratov was there, the famous editor of Novaya Gazeta, talking about the fact that even if you don't know what difference you're making as a journalist, it's crucially important to record the facts.
And of course he, Dmitry Muratov and Maria Ressa of Rappler in the Philippines were both awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because of the vital importance of their work in creating a peaceful and open democratic world. So that's how important it is. One little anecdote I recall earlier this year, the team from Sky News who were shot up on location in Ukraine spoke. In fact, of course, they reported widely, and that incident was reported. What happened was they were in a car and there was a kind of ambush, or they were shot at unexpectedly. There were other cars involved as well, and all of the Sky team survived because they knew that the car was not a safe place. So even though they risked everything, they jumped out of the car into a ditch, rolled around, tried to escape, and they escaped without death. Whereas others who didn't know what to do were in the car and they died in the hail of bullets. So that's how important it is. It is life or death. So last 1 or 2 minutes, let's have at least one more contribution from the floor, please. Aren't you embarrassed? Yes, please.
Okay, I'm not sure I got this the first time. I don't know if it was mentioned. How was Rory Petros funded? And secondly, knowing what we learned yesterday from a war reporter who, of course, she's been in Ukraine, it's not very easy doing it alone. Would you advise young journalists to go freelance, knowing for sure that, of course, they will be more objective and the advantages to doing that? But would you advise young and upcoming journalists to go freelance if they have the two options facing?
Okay, that's two very good questions. I didn't mention how we're funded. We do share our funders in the back of the leaflet here, which I've put on the front 2 rows here if anybody's interested. The majority of our funding comes from industry corporate donations. So there are many broadcasters, including British and American and international news outlets like Al Jazeera and ZDF, who support us. We do also get funding from the Google News Initiative and Meta to help deliver our programs. We are also reliant on a lot of individual donations. So earlier this year, we had 80 news journalists from London newsrooms fundraise on behalf of the Rory Pack Trust by running the London Royal Parks Half Marathon. There's a huge support within the industry because all of staff journalists understand the huge reliance on freelance, local and national journalists that news gathering needs. It can't happen without freelancers and local journalists. So to your second question about whether I would recommend being a freelance journalist, I think it really depends what kind of journalism you want to do. I would discourage any new journalism graduate without any experience to go to a war zone. Quite frankly, some have made their name that way. I think it's unbelievably risky and you will be a burden on the local community of journalists there. We actually don't give HEFAT training to anyone that has less than 2 years journalism experience for that very reason. However, journalism, if it's not conflict reporting, freelance journalism is a great way to make your name. Obviously, it's very difficult to make a living out of freelance journalism, and most freelance journalists have an alternative income, an alternative way of earning their living. I know a lot of freelance journalists who do comms or teach or do other work on the side to subsidise the journalism that they want to do. That's just a reality and you should be aware of that. But the truth is it's very, very difficult to get a staff job as a new journalism graduate. So freelancing is a way to follow your interests, to learn how to market yourself, to be a bit of an entrepreneur, and you have to be an entrepreneur if you're going to be a freelance journalist. You are the product, you have to sell yourself. And I would recommend really just being clear about the kind of journalism you want to do and why. Why you're doing what you're doing is going to keep you motivated, keep you focused, and help you sell yourself and your work.
Thank you very much, Dr. We're coming to the end of the first session, and we will give you a short restful break, 5 minutes or so. Just a quick check now whether our contributor from here for Oksana Norman is with us for a quick comment before we wrap up this session. In the next session, we'll hear from Oksana, who, as I say, is the director of the Institute of Mass Information, has played a key role in the evolution of a much more diverse and professional media scene in Ukraine in the last 10 years or so. And we will get a glimpse also from Taras Pedieko, who's a research fellow at Sterling University and a sociologist who's followed very closely the development of media as a whole society of his own country, Ukraine. And one of the issues we will be looking at and that issue is still very alive. Just checking, Oksana, are you hearing us? And did you hear some of the previous session? Before we take our short break, would you just have one quick comment about what you've heard in the last hour? Can we hear?
She put up the mic.
Ah, you're muted. You're muted.
Just trying to
Oksana?
again.
Yes, she's trying now.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello from Kiev. Thank you for inviting to this very interesting session. Actually, we have 11,000 journalists in Ukraine on the front lines, and nobody knows when this war finishes. But I hope that you will report about rebuilding Ukraine and not about killing and atrocities of people. Thank you for inviting, and see you at the next session.
Very good. We'll be there within about 5 minutes. Thank you, Oksana, for joining us there. Thank you. Please don't go far. Come back in 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you very much. We'll start again.
So Oksana will be back in about 5 minutes.
a very central part in the extraordinary development of that country, particularly in the last 10 years. I remember 8 to 10 years ago, before the Russian incursion, the takeover of the Donbass region, the Maidan revolution, the incidents where the IMI and other organizations were monitoring the aggression and killing and beating of journalists who were part of the democracy movement or trying to report on the iniquities and injustices of the then government. And since then, there have been very extraordinary attempts at reform of the justice system, of the oligarch system, of the post-Soviet system, and yet problems remain. And of course, the Russian invasion is designed precisely to destabilize all those efforts and to prevent Ukraine from becoming a Western-oriented, open and democratic state. Both our speakers today are extremely well placed to address these issues, and we can learn from it. Oksana is going to focus her remarks, I think, on the special challenges which have arisen for journalists in terms of the skills, the professional skills, the safety issues, the challenges of keeping the professional standards in this extraordinary situation of a military invasion where you don't know whether you will die if you stand outside in the street, and the pressures to verify information under fire, and also in this sort of information war. So Oksana, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Oksana has some challenges. Yes, she's on now. Okay. Yes.
We do. Yes, we do. Please, go ahead. Hello, please.
This is my solar battery. I use it to charge my devices, and I really recommend it if you go to such places where there are problems with electricity. And we push out of our comfort zone in terms of doing our journalistic work. Not only security challenges appeared in our life, but also challenges connected with professional standards, with journalism ethics. And we understood that professional standards are actually the very, very important thing. They are the key. They are the answer if you do not know how to report about some very terrible situation. Another solution is your journalistic community. When we had this situation, when like the invasion started, actually we have a very, very energetic journalistic community in Ukraine. We have plenty of chats, and we discuss how to report this or that thing. For instance, we had a situation when Bucha, a city in Kyiv Oblast, was liberated. Volunteers, the girls who were raped by Russian soldiers. And on the one hand, it is socially important topic. You have to report about it because the world should know about this crime. But on the other hand, you cannot report because it's a very, very sensitive issue for these girls, about their privacy, about their future, and even about about the audience who will read this story. So we discussed it with journalists very much, and we decided to go through interviewing not the victims, but people who worked with this situation, not to traumatize victims. Another very important thing. So journalists talked with volunteers, with psychologists, and of course, no personal details were given out. So you should also think about ethical standards. Challenges were also connected about how to report about deaths, about personal data of people who were killed, and of course you cannot report before families were officially informed about that, because this is just respect to the families. You cannot, they should not learn about the death of their loved ones from just mass media. And of course we cannot take balance now from the other side for obvious reasons. We had some funny situations. Just in September, there was an Italian guy who decided to go directly through the battlefield, through the minefield, to the other side. He took a taxi driver, he paid him money, and they just, like, he started in Kherson Oblast from the Ukrainian side. There was a heavy battle, very tough battle, shooting, artillery, infantry, whatever you can imagine. And they just drove on the side, through the field, through the minefield. They ran on a mine. The car was damaged, the journalist was wounded, the driver died. The other side immediately took him as a spy, arrested him, and as far as I remember, the Italian foreign ministry had a huge headache of solving this situation. So common sense, consulting with colleagues who know better how to do it, and learning rules how to report about the war is extremely important. And besides, when you go to report about the war, there are special rules for any war in the world. They are connected with saving human lives and with your non-participation as a side of the conflict. These rules, there are such rules that you do not report about the future battle plans. You do not expose future plans. This is like, you cannot do it as a journalist. You do not report the exact number of personnel or exact number of military vehicles, because it will be your participation in the battle, because you expose this to the other side. How to say? I know that there are satellites, and you can look through the satellite and find out everything you want, but these are ethical rules or something like that. Well, another situation is connected with gender balance. Because of the war, there are really a lot of information about military men, and the information about women has reduced in public space. For the moment, we have probably this balance of around 20% of media reports devoted to women and 80% devoted to men. So if you are, as a journalist, going to report from the battlefield, remember about gender balance and speaking about the role of women as well. Well, there are also different aspects connected with pictures, photos, videos. You should be very sure that the photo or video is connected exactly with the situation you are talking about. You cannot use the old photo or the old video, because people who will consume your information may risk their lives, may take this information and make some decisions that may affect their lives. And yes, probably one of the most important issues, I would say that it is ethics and respect. We had, we are very grateful to journalists who arrived in Ukraine to report about this war. They risked their lives. We are really, really very grateful to them. But at the same time, there were some cases when journalists were looking for hype, and they really entered the hospital. There was a shelling in the city of Vinnytsia, and one mother, she lost her child, and she didn't know that her child died. Journalists rushed to the hospital and told the mother that her daughter didn't survive, and they filmed it on camera. There was a huge scandal among journalistic community. The hospital said they will not allow journalists anymore because of this very unethical situation. And I think ethical principles are very, very important. This war has shown to us that professional quality journalism is the guard, I don't know, is the key, the very, very important thing for security, for your country not to attack other countries, for your country not to turn into a terrorist state. Unfortunately, Russia killed, eliminated, wiped out its space from professional journalism. And Russian propaganda is influencing the population, by different polls, from 70 to 80% of Russian citizens support invasion to Ukraine and support actions of Russian military men in Ukraine. And this is the direct result of the absence of professional quality journalism. This is a direct result of Russian informational campaigning in support of this totalitarian regime, Putin regime, in support of the actions of Kremlin. If there were enough professional quality developed journalism, if people were properly informed, I think that this wouldn't happen. This war just wouldn't happen. And another interesting thing with this disinformation and propaganda is that it is becoming more and more aggressive. We do not say now disinformation because now we see traces of genocidal rhetoric. And we have analyzed the Rwanda tribunal. We have analyzed international legislation on genocide, and we see a perspective for this Russian Kremlin propagandists to make them accountable, and I hope that someday we will see them in international tribunal. Examples of genocidal rhetoric can be connected with attacks on civic infrastructure. For instance, the anchors and managers of Russian television RT or Russia 1, they openly called to throw nuclear bombs to Ukrainian cities. When there were attacks on civic infrastructure, they said that it is not enough. We should kill more people. They also, another example of genocidal rhetoric is connected with kidnapping of children. I don't know whether you are aware of that, but Russians have kidnapped and separated from their parents several thousands of Ukrainian children, and they gave them given them for adoption to Russian families, and they approve this activity in Russian state informational resources. This is also an example of genocidal rhetorics. And besides, there are calls to aggressive war, calls to violate territorial integrity, etc., etc. So information, how you put it, how you defend professional standards and quality has a direct connection with human lives, with protection of democracy. And your work is extremely important for the future of our world. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, and that's a very important point. Let's just pause for a moment. I'd like to have some questions for you for this interactive session. Taras, if you've got any question, please speak to get a dialogue between yourself. This is Taras Pediako, who is a scholar. He's a research fellow at St Andrews University in Scotland and an expert. I mean, I myself, Oksana, I am very conscious. I've been following the situation in Ukraine for many years. Your organization, your NGO, and organizations like Stop Fake is one of the early examples of a very forensic and effective attempt to counter Russian propaganda with facts. What is your estimation, Oksana, of the impact on international opinion of these anti-fake news efforts? Is it successful, or are you willing to put information out or not?
I'm afraid it is not successful because we propose, so on the one hand, we have a huge machine, which is a state machine, which is aimed at occupying other territories, whatever, which is very seriously financed by gas money. And on the other hand, we even do not have any legal mechanism to oppose this situation. The basic two things to fight against disinformation that are popular in Europe are debunking of fake and media literacy. I support both of them, but from what I see now in Ukraine, I'm afraid these efforts are not enough, and probably we need a new European task force to develop a proper legal response to this situation. We plan to go, of course, for international litigation.
Sorry, could you describe how that would work? How would a European task force work and be more effective? How would it work?
Sorry, I can't hear you well. Can you repeat, or?
How would a European task force work? How would it be effective?
We need to develop a legal response to this situation, and I think we need new definitions for sure. Because what we see in Russia, it is not that kind of disinformation, like your neighbor shared in social network a fake about coronavirus. It is not like that. It is. It has several components. Dehumanization of all Ukrainians as ethnicity. We are all called Nazis, rats, like some insect. I don't remember the name of this insect in English. Second, they call it a sacred war. And Russian Orthodox Church, Kadyrov, Muslim, they are very involved in promotion the concept of the blessed warriors who are fighting against dirty devils on the Ukrainian land. Then there are, of course, open calls to attacks on infrastructure, and well, there are very, very, very many examples and different types of this aggressive propaganda. But we should understand that disinformation here is just one of the instruments. There are very many instruments that are not that straightforward. like if you go to church and your church tells you that this is a sacred war, you are an angel if you participate in it. This is not disinformation. This is a manipulation, psychological manipulation. And they also use a lot of social networks. They use Telegram. It is a Russian social network. They create tens of Telegram channels in the newly occupied territories to promote emotions of fear, hate, like they say that Kyiv was already occupied or liberated, how they say. You have to yield, you have no perspective, you have to take Russian passport, you have like was already solved or something like that.
Oksana, thank you. I want to give Taras a chance to make his presentation, but first I think, Taras, you may have a question first.
Quick question, Oksana, do you hear me? Hello, hi. It's
yes.
Pleasure.
Yes, hi.
Say a few words in Ukrainian.
Вітаю вас і радий вас бачити знову. Мені здається, останнього разу ми бачилися в 18 році. So, my question is this. You've given us a very good taster of the challenges that are facing Ukrainian journalists and the community of journalists as a profession as a whole. And of course, you are in a crucial position, that profession, as the leader of one of the organizations that oversee professional standards and promote the ethics of journalists. And one thing that the audiences in Western Europe might have not appreciated enough in the context of the current war and the war that has preceded the invasion is just how crucial the debate in Ukraine has been about the balance between media freedom and security. This is something that I think journalists have debated among themselves for a very, very long time. There have been different opinions, and very often outside audiences, including international unions, have commented on the situation in Ukraine from the perspective just of the media freedom, but not of the security implications of reporting at war. Could you say a couple of words about the current state of debate inside the profession? Is the profession in Ukraine united in their response to the invasion, or do you see any differences in opinion and any lively debates? You've hinted at some scandals, but maybe you could say a bit more about that.
Yes, I can say that we are really very united. Probably the unification is one of the biggest that I have seen. But I mean this unification among professional quality journalism. Of course, we have a lot of different types of oligarchic media, okay, I will not tell the names, and they still have their policy, and they still have their attitude. We have a united marathon of news, which was launched actually in February. Every major news TV channel has a slot of around 5 hours, and they are reporting one by one. And this united marathon of news is criticized because the majority of speakers there are representatives of political party. We have a very vivid community, I have to say. We have a lot of discussions. However, we are united now in their attitude toward security, because we understand that there are special really rules that are necessary when there is a war. If you do not have the war, of course you can whatever, but if you have a war and if you report about some specific location or some specific I don't know, geographic coordinate, professional journalists know about it, including international journalists who arrive here. This may affect human lives. People may die because of it, and you will become a part of the conflict because you contributed to it. I'm sure you wouldn't like to have this ethical dilemma for your life. There are rules I can send to organizers later, maybe this will be interesting for the students. But for us now, the question about security is probably one of the top priorities because it is connected with our survival. However, I'm surprised. I also just one more thing. I'm surprised because I expected that we will have more censorship. We will have more whatever, I don't know, Ukrainian fakes. But our reports are quite trustworthy, and journalists discuss it between themselves that the figures are really correspond to reality. So it's like that. But there are restrictions also.
Thank you. Later, I would like your comment about documenting war crimes during the war. That's one area we've not asked you about. Now I'd like to hear from Taras Federico himself, his presentation. If you could listen to it, Oksana, then we will continue the conversation in 10 minutes. Thank you, Taras.
Thank you, William. Thank you, organizers. Taras' presentation has made my task a bit easier because she's mentioned quite a few of the important topics that have touched on the lives of journalists in Ukraine and the work of journalists in Ukraine. I'm myself a Ukrainian, and I'm very much a co-participant in the story of the Ukrainian conflict. And because of that, partly I also mind my words here. But I would like to speak about some of the background aspects of the transformation of the journalistic profession and the media profession in Ukraine since the invasion of the 24th of February. And I would like to speak not as a journalist, because I'm not one, but as a researcher of journalism and a social anthropologist who has since 2017 been doing research on journalists and people like Oksana. So to understand how Ukrainian media have responded to the invasion, what has changed in the media industry, and how this has affected the public debate about the conduct of war since the Russian invasion, I need to go back to the period before the invasion and say a couple of words about the relationship between the Ukrainian media owners, and the authorities. And the one important fact that you need to keep in mind is that the Ukrainian media industry, the Ukrainian news journalism, is split between a majority of the profession that works for very few privately owned broadcasters and other news organizations, and a minority small independent news organizations. So the media ownership in Ukraine, private media ownership across all types of media, is highly concentrated. So take, for instance, broadcasting. Since the financial crisis of 2008, approximately 3/4 of Ukrainian broadcast media were owned by just 4 financial industrial groups. These groups, locally known by the names of the oligarchs who control them, have routinely sought to use their influence, use the news media as instruments of informal influence on the state, specifically in negotiations over preferential deals with the state for their businesses in the energy, metallurgy, and other industrial sectors. And this has an implication. Why I talk about this is because this has an implication what kind of media survived during the war and how they can produce their news at a time when revenues across all types of media fall. So in February this year, Russia invaded Ukraine. And this has been perhaps the single most dramatic event transforming the Ukrainian media system. And I want to focus on 2 aspects of it. One being the reformatting of broadcasting, and the other being economic challenges to news production and to news producers. So the full-scale invasion disrupted production of most major broadcasters and press in Ukraine in manifold ways. Reporters, producers, and editors were displaced, their families been displaced and in danger, and ad revenues and owners' subsidies decreased. None of the major media outlets could continue to operate as before. So in the words of Ukraine's Minister of Culture, Alexander Tkachenko, who was a former CEO of one of the oligarchic media groups, but a prominent one, the invasion has provoked, quote, not a crisis, but a complete transformation of the media landscape, end quote. The key government response to the invasion in the media domain, as Oksana has mentioned, has been to consolidate several of the major broadcasters into a so-called United News Marathon. And under it, each of the invited media, and about 6 of them, produce about 4 to 5 hours of TV content per day, which then are combined with other content produced by other producers, other participants, into a continued news marathon, which is broadcast 24/7 by all of the participants, and in fact all of the major media broadcasting companies in Ukraine. So this, on the one hand, has decreased the cost of participating companies and participating channels, but on the other hand, deprived them from aid revenues and forced them to sponsor government media policy. This is de facto been a kind of an expropriation of the airspace by the state in the interest of state security and of united information policy. So needless to say, the news broadcast by the United Marathon are envisioned on the model of wartime strategic communication rather than on the model of critical reporting that seeks to hold the government of Ukraine to account. And I think there is a broad consensus across Kyiv's media profession that has hinted at that this is a necessary and a temporary measure in the service of Ukraine's very survival. So for instance, Yulia McGuffey, editor-in-chief at NVA.ua, a quality independent print organization, has said recently that, quote, really all of us, big and small media, are to an extent propagandists because we are working for Ukraine's victory. We are propagandists because we propagate Ukraine's victory. Nonetheless, in the past several months, there has been increasing criticism of this arrangement. So 3 major TV channels affiliated with ex-president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, have been first excluded from the United Marathon, then taken off air for not complying with a policy that required them to broadcast the marathon in which they were denied participation. The state-owned Rada channel, which had much lower viewing figures than any of the Poroshenko's channels, has been included in the marathon and given state funding to participate in it. There are signs that Rada, as opposed to other participants in the marathon, is using the opportunity for promoting the government and individuals' figures within the government rather than broad interests of the state. And I talk about this just to give you a taster, not to, as it were, air the dirty laundry of Ukraine in an International Journalism Week, but to give you a taste of just the complexity of the problems that journalists working in Ukraine, working for Ukrainian organizations, are now facing. It is not just a question of security versus freedom of speech. It is also the question of how you produce the news in the existing conditions, under existing or new government regulations that create quite a minefield for the news producers. So against this background of the consolidation of broadcasting, there are also rather complex transformations across the media industry that can be traced to the economic crisis that the invasion has thrown Ukrainian media into. Speaking at an industry event in Kyiv 2 months ago, the chief editor of Forbes Ukraine said that according to their survey data, businesses' ads budgets in the print press might have fallen by as much as 45% since February 2022. Right, so it's almost decreased almost in half. Ministry of Culture Tkachenko gave a gloomy estimate. He said the TV ad budgets have fallen by 90%, and online media ad market has shrunk by 60 to 70%, which is, linger on that figure, 60 to 70%, even 90% for the broadcasters. So an important consequence of this shift across print, online, and broadcast media has been that news organizations have shifted to cheaper news products. One result of that has been the increase in quote-unquote structural censorship that allows for greater influence of small groups of trusted newsmakers on public discussion. So newsmakers that are easy to reach for news journalists, but that easy to look into this cheaper process of producing news. So take, for example, Ukrainska Pravda, a major Ukrainian truth, a major online current affairs publication, and one of the flagship independent organizations in the media sector in Ukraine. Its cheapest and most widely read product are short articles about breaking news. And they have significantly decreased in quality. And they're evidently not edited, or at any rate, not edited well. And they have increasingly come to resemble Telegram blog posts that often almost literally copy the content produced by Telegram bloggers on their channels in sometimes more, sometimes less propagandistic, but at any rate, not heavily edited, not kind of overproduced by journalists themselves. So production is, as it were, outsourced to other figures than journalists themselves. So the war has not only undermined media revenues, but also made reporting on the ground significantly more expensive because of fuel costs, because of the logistics costs, and so on. And we are seeing media across the board turning to whipping up news stories on the basis of blog posts and unconfirmed reports by bloggers. And this is an indication for whose stories are told. So because this favors activist middle classes and elites local and national, as producers of news, at the expense of reporting on more expensive and more complex, more difficult to reach human interest stories, analytical articles, and investigations. Added to that is that Ukrainian news journalists are increasingly competing not just against each other, or with each other, but with foreign news and broadcast journalists, foreign press and broadcast journalists. Reflecting Ukraine's dependence on foreign support for the war, American broadsheet that have had access to both Ukrainian and American government sources have consistently been the first to break the big political stories of the invasion, since the invasion.
Tell us, I'd like you to wind up rather quickly.
So, Ukrainian reporters who do seek to report from the ground find themselves dependent for access, transportation, and access to sources on military press offices or trusted contacts. And this, on the one hand, ensures a degree of editorial control by the military over sensitive information, but on the other, allows for creeping self-censorship. So, because the military are quite sensitive about what gets reported for good reason, as Oksana has mentioned. So the combination of, first, the rearranged infrastructure of broadcasting, with second, public rallying around the flag, with third, journalists' new understanding of their role as defending Ukraine's information security, with a shift in the production of lower quality, cheaper media product competing against foreign producers, has had and will continue to have a chilling effect on the quality and the very possibility of public discussion about the war. I think, if anything, this has highlighted that critical news reporting, which is never cheap, has become ever more expensive in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Thank you.
Thank you. Understood. Before we go back to Oksana, I would like to put a question to you, tell us about moral equivalence, because you have been highly critical of the media in Ukraine, your own country, but you've got to have not taken much account of the fact that the Russian media scene is, as Oksana described, it is part of a genocidal project in her estimation. Would you perhaps like just to correct, or rather address that point yourself, so that everybody here knows what you think about the Russian media role in the war?
Thank you, William, for that. I think it's an important aside that I'm speaking here, presuming that I'm speaking to a community of like-minded people who, like me, share the overall goal of Ukraine's victory in the war. And in light of that, I've allowed myself to be slightly critical of the situation on the ground in my own country. I think it is important to keep in mind that both as researchers and as journalists in this war, as ever, but especially in this war, we have to keep in mind the balance between, and for me, it's a new thing for me as a researcher, because we focus on quite narrow aspects of media functioning, the media systems researchers. But when I speak publicly about this since the beginning of the war, I'm constantly confronted with questions such as this, which is, we need to put Ukraine's problem in the context of the fact that the war is existential for Ukrainian journalists and the Ukrainian public. So all of these problems are very small compared to what is looming over the Ukrainian media industry.
Thank you. I want to ask Oksana about the issue of the media's role in trying to document war crimes in a factual way. But first, we have one question from the audience, which I'd like to share with you, both with Taras briefly first, and then with Oksana, please. The questioner says, given that both Soviet territories, that's to say Russia and Ukraine, had high levels of corruption after the end of the Cold War, why did the journalism ethos develop so differently in Ukraine and in Russia? If you could answer briefly, tell us, and then we'll ask Oksana.
I think the developments in both Ukraine and Russia were rather similar. So in both countries in the 90s, the journalistic profession was highly dependent on and subordinate to media owners. But in Russia, since Vladimir Putin
came to power in the late 90s, all of the media ownership was kind of consolidated under the political tutelage of one figure, the president. In Ukraine, the media industry has been much more pluralistic. And as a result of that, there's been a lot more discussion among journalists about the standards of the profession. But more importantly, you can hear divergent points of views, even if they are not always free from interference of media owners. But there's no one figure who's consolidated under his political power all of the media producers.
And Oksana, hearing us, what do you say about the commitment to democracy of generally of Ukrainian society? Is that the key element in the different development of media in Ukraine and in Russia in the last 15 years?
Actually, I do support the Taras speech, and his speech is actually the indicator of democracy in Ukraine, because we are in reality very critical. We have a very good independent online media. We have oppositional television, though it was not allowed in the United Marathon. We make statements all the time. We live through different forms of civic protests. And one big difference from Russia is that we are in a kind of post-colonial situation. We had to fight for our identity, for our language, for our, how to say, for our own way, for our identification. While Russia, actually, they admire USSR and they want, how they put it, their territories back. While for us, it is very, very different situation. This is why I think we had different ways of development. We really were looking for different ways. We were trying this and this. We were protesting all the time because we were like developing as a new country, as a post-colonial country. While Russia did not have to fight for identity, for I don't know, for building this new, Russia inherited this Soviet-style, very vertical structure. Even if you look at their communication, how communication looks like, Russian communication is very vertical. It is very dry, how to say. It is not flexible at all. While Ukrainian communication is very, very flexible, it involves a lot of different memes, it involves a lot of grassroots communication, yes, and it involves a lot of criticism, and again, and we are not happy with, we are very critical, but yes, this is democracy. This is how it looks like.
Thank you, Oksana. I'm going to allow myself one comment for the students and everybody. It's very noticeable that the Russian media can be accused of direct participation in the aggression against Ukraine. In particular, you look at the situation of the occupation of Crimea in early 2014, where President Putin personally invited state media to cover the takeover, which in the end, force was not required, but the media were given medals for their coverage of the Russian recapture, as the Russians said, of Crimea, and the medals were struck, apparently, were made several weeks before it happened. So then there was a ceremony where the media who had misinformed the Russian public and covered up, concealed the fact that the little green men were actually members of the Russian armed forces to take over what was actually a foreign territory of a foreign country. So that could be well described already as participation in war, which is potentially a war crime. The second point I would make is that we heard earlier, you've both spoken about the role of journalists correctly, legitimately, not reporting the exact location of, for example, Russian attacks on buildings, because that would give information to the Russians. On the other hand, the Russian media has consistently, state media consistently, used the same language as the Kremlin about the vile language which you mentioned, cockroaches or insects and Nazis and so on about the Ukrainians. And of course, they are intimately working with the armed forces. So that was just a comment really. Do we have any other quick question from the floor? One more. No, we've done that one. Oh yes, this is an important point. I'll ask you, Oksana. Is it immoral for the Ukrainian government to suspend, to ban pro-Putin Kremlin publications and broadcasts? This is an important question also for us in Europe.
I'm sorry, but I'm not aware of this situation. The Ukrainian government did what? Suspended the price of accreditation.
They removed Russian state media from the airwaves.
Yes, of course, because Russian state media, which are financed by Kremlin, they are active participants of the informational war, and this is confirmed by several levels. First, they are 100% financed by Russia. Second, if you look at the balance, it is absolutely absent, and balance is like 100%. They are promoting Putin military doctrine. They are promoting only calls to invasion. They are praising their different crimes, attacks, missile strikes. They call for more, etc., etc. Then, well, there is a whole spectrum of legal evidence that confirms that these media are actually not media by themselves, but they are instruments of this war. And this is confirmed on the basis of international legislation. We are working now also with Reporters Without Borders. We work with ICC, the International Criminal Court experts, and we base on like, it's not our conclusions because we are like Ukrainians, but these are really very important point of view. And this kind of information is aggressive propaganda. It's not just propaganda. It's not just disinformation. It is really something that makes this war possible. This is really an accomplice, an important part of this very serious, probably crime over crimes, how to say, very serious crime against humanity. So I hope that they will be made accountable and we will see them in the international trial, yes.
Thank you, Oksana. I think on another occasion we should have a session on precisely the investigations into war crimes in Ukraine. This is now a major issue for the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the regional courts like the European Court, and the statistics which I saw, I think there was the UN investigation was counting tens of thousands of Russian alleged war crimes, attacks on hospitals, on schools, on civilians, atrocities, killing of prisoners, deportation of many thousands of Ukrainian children, etc. And they were also open to document war crimes on the Ukrainian side. And there were a couple, as far as I know, it was about 2, which was mistreatment of Russian prisoners. I mean, that was their evidence so far. So I think we must bring the session to an end, but I would just comment that the fascinating part of this story to journalists everywhere has been the ability of Ukrainian media, NGOs, social media, and indeed the government to use social media, to use Telegram and Signal and so on, to expose to the Russian public or the mothers of the soldiers the reality that their own soldiers are against the war, that they do not respect their commanders, that they do not believe in the law, in the war, and indeed they want to go home. So this is a really interesting turn, I think, in the propaganda war, which maybe gives some hope. But Oksana, you have been really enlightening, and we're very grateful to you for your contribution today. Let's have a round of applause from the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation, and I hope it was interesting and useful.
Well, please stay safe, and we wish you very well, and hope to see you in London in better.
Thank you.
So my final comment is just, we've been talking about the purposes of journalism, the new challenges of journalism in the new world, and particularly in conflict and tension. You know, it's a truism to say that the first casualty of war is truth. But we've seen that it's more complicated than that in a situation like this, where we have a clear aggression against from one state of another in the modern Europe. This is a challenge for the whole world. It's a challenge for the legal system, and it's a challenge for all journalists. So thank you, everybody, for taking part today. Taras and all our speakers.
Thank you.